My dad transferred my $260K to my brother, then asked why I was suddenly so quiet. It wasn't even about the money, not really, not at first. It was about the sheer, brutal certainty of it. The way he said it like he was clearing a desk, like he was tidying up loose ends. "Just a little adjustment, sweetheart," he'd chirped, his voice that too bright, too careful tone he reserved for conversations that went south. He'd slid the tablet across the polished oak of the dining room table, the screen showing a transaction confirmation, his lawyer's name barely visible in the corner. $260,000. Gone. Not to an investment, not to a down payment on a house I'd been dreaming about for years, but into a holding account in my brother's name, Daniel. My older brother, the golden child, the one who always seemed to have the effortless grace and the easy smile that Dad's own reflected back at him. I remember the clinking of ice in my parents' glasses, the soft murmur of the TV in the living room, the smell of lemon polish and my mom's expensive perfume. It was a Sunday, late October. The leaves outside had turned, a riot of crimson and gold against the crisp blue sky. We were at their sprawling estate in Greenwich, the kind of house that felt more like a museum than a home, filled with heirlooms and hushed corners. I'd flown in from Chicago for the weekend, a rare treat, a chance to feel like the daughter I used to be, before my career, before the distance, before this. Adjustment? I echoed, my voice a little too high, a little too shaky. My fingers traced the numbers on the screen, a cold dread spreading through my chest. I'd been saving that money for years, meticulously, painstakingly. It was the seed money for my own firm, a graphic design agency I'd poured my heart and soul into building. It was independence. It was my future, written in zeros. Dad waved a dismissive hand, his diamond cufflinks catching the chandelier light. "Daniel's having a bit of a cash flow issue with the new development project. Just a temporary thing. He'll pay it right back, of course, he promised." He took a long sip of his scotch, his eyes meeting mine over the rim of the glass, and for the first time I saw not paternal affection, but a strange, chilling pragmatism. He didn't see my dreams. He saw a convenient balance sheet. Mom, bless her oblivious heart, piped up from the head of the table. "Oh, that's wonderful, dear. Daniel always knows how to handle business. Isn't that good, darling?" She offered me a tight, practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind that always suggested she was holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She hated conflict, especially between her children, and Dad's pronouncements, however brutal, were usually followed by a swift, almost desperate attempt to smooth things over, to pretend everything was perfectly fine. "Temporary?" I managed, my throat tight. "Dad, that was my entire savings. That was the down payment for my office space. That was my life's work." The words felt like ash in my mouth. I looked at him, searching for any flicker of remorse, any hint of understanding. All I found was that familiar impatience, the subtle tightening of his jaw that meant he was done listening. "Don't be dramatic, Eleanor," he said, his tone hardening. "It's a loan. Daniel is family. He'll repay it. And frankly, with the way your little business is going, I doubt you'd be able to leverage that kind of capital anyway." He said it with a certainty that knocked the wind out of me. My little business? He'd always been dismissive, never truly acknowledging the late nights, the sacrifices, the sheer grit it took to build something from scratch in a city like Chicago. He saw success only in terms of inherited wealth, of established empires, not in the messy, exhilarating fight of creating something new. Daniel, who had been lounging in an armchair by the fireplace, finally looked up, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He was dressed in a sharp designer suit, effortlessly radiating an air of success that always seemed to be bestowed upon him, not earned. "Yeah, Ellie," he drawled. "Don't worry, you'll get it back. Probably with a little interest, too. Dad's good with these things." He winked, a gesture that felt like a jab. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he reveled in the power it gave him. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, oppressive silence. The carefully constructed facade of a happy family reunion had shattered, leaving behind shards of resentment and a gaping chasm where my trust used to be. My hands were trembling, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. You just took it?" I whispered, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Dad finally put his glass down. "I facilitated a transfer, Eleanor, for the good of the family." He leaned back, his posture radiating an almost regal dismissal. "Daniel is in a crucial phase of his career. He needs liquidity. You have time. You're young." Young. I was 32. I'd been working my tail off for a decade, building a life for myself that was entirely separate from the gilded cage of my family's expectations. And now, he just casually ripped away a cornerstone of that carefully constructed independence. The humiliation washed over me in hot waves, a sickening mix of disbelief and fury. My own father, the man who was supposed to protect me, had betrayed me in the most fundamental way. He had sided with his golden boy, using my own money to prop him up, and then had the audacity to patronize me. So, what? I choked out, my voice cracking. Mom stood up, her face a mask of concern. Eleanor, please, don't make a scene. Your father knows what he's doing. It will all work out. She reached out a hand towards me, but I flinched away. I couldn't bear her faux comfort, her determined denial of the harsh reality unfolding before us. Work out? I repeated, a harsh laugh escaping my lips. How? By Daniel graciously returning my own money months or years from now, when I've missed my deadlines, when my investors pull out, when my entire business collapses because my father decided to play banker for his precious son? The words tumbled out, sharp and ragged, laced with a pain I hadn't known I could feel so acutely. Dad's eyes narrowed. That's enough, Eleanor. You're being highly disrespectful. Daniel will honor his commitment. His commitment? I was on the verge of tears, but a cold, hard resolve was starting to solidify within me, like ice forming on a winter lake. His commitment is to himself, and your commitment is to him. And my commitment, I paused, looking from my father to my brother, their faces impassive, almost bored by my distress. My commitment is to myself, and I'm starting to realize that means I need to be a lot smarter than all of you. I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving them in the suffocating opulence of their world. The heavy oak door of the estate closed behind me with a soft thud, but the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the pregnant, terrifying silence of a storm gathering. I got into my rental car, the worn leather seats a stark contrast to the plush velvet of their furniture. As I pulled away, the grand house receding in my rearview mirror, a single tear finally escaped, tracing a hot path down my cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated fury. The drive back to my hotel in the city was a blur of unspoken rage. Every mile was a confirmation of the betrayal, a hardening of my resolve. I replayed the conversation, Dad's casual dismissal, Daniel's smug smirk, Mom's futile attempts at peacemaking. They thought they had silenced me, reduced me to the quiet, compliant daughter. They thought my tears and my trembling hands meant defeat. They were wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. By the time I reached my hotel, checked in, and locked the door to my sterile, anonymous room, the tears had stopped. The raw pain had morphed into something else, something colder, sharper. It was a clarity born of absolute disillusionment. They had taken my money, yes. They had belittled my ambitions, yes. But in doing so, they had inadvertently given me something far more valuable: permission to stop caring about their approval, about their judgment, about their suffocating embrace. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the crisp white sheets feeling alien and unforgiving. I pulled out my laptop, the glowing screen a familiar source of comfort and power. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, 1,000 possibilities swirling in my mind. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. They wanted to silence me? Fine. I would learn to speak a language they understood, a language of power, a language of consequences. The initial shock and hurt were still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but they were being overshadowed by a growing sense of grim determination. They thought this was just about $260,000. They had no idea what they had truly unleashed. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. My eyes were hard, resolute. The daughter they thought they knew, the one who would retreat into quiet submission, was gone. A different woman was emerging, forged in the crucible of their betrayal. I started typing, the click of the keys a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet room. I was going to build my firm, and I was going to build it bigger and better than they could ever imagine. And then, when I had the power, when I had the leverage, I would make them understand the true cost of their actions. They wanted me quiet. They were about to learn that sometimes silence is just the prelude to a roar. I started drafting emails, making calls, reaching out to contacts I hadn't spoken to in months, the ones who believed in me, the ones who saw my vision. I wasn't just building a business anymore. I was building an arsenal. I looked again at the transaction confirmation on my phone, the one Dad had left on the table. $260,000. It was a number that represented a setback, but also, now, a target, a debt to be repaid, not just in dollars, but in kind. I remember Dad's smug assurance, Daniel will pay it right back. What if he didn't? What if temporary became permanent? What if my father, in his infinite wisdom, had actually handed Daniel the keys to my financial ruin? The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through me, but it was quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. This was no longer just about proving them wrong. This was about survival. I opened a new document, the blank page staring back at me. This wasn't just a business plan anymore. This was a manifesto. I started outlining. I wasn't going to play by their rules. I wasn't going to wait for their permission. I was going to rewrite the entire game. I thought about the lawyers I knew, the venture capitalists who had expressed interest in my company, the mentors who had guided me. They were all valuable resources, but I needed something more. I needed a strategy that was as ruthless as their betrayal. I started researching legal loopholes, offshore accounts, anything that could level the playing field. It felt like a dark path, but the image of my father's indifferent face, my brother's smirking satisfaction, propelled me forward. They had underestimated me, reduced me to a footnote in their privileged lives. They had taken my money, but they had also given me an education, and I was a very fast learner. The silence, they thought, was their defeat. They didn't understand. The silence was my power. It was the calm before the storm, and I was the one about to unleash it. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was going to be a very long, very expensive fight, and I intended to win. The days that followed were a whirlwind of frantic activity. I canceled my return flight to Chicago, telling my colleagues I had a family emergency. The truth was, I was embroiled in a different kind of emergency, one that required my full, undivided attention. I spent hours in libraries, poring over financial law books, poring over articles about hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. I wasn't an expert in any of this, but I was desperate, and desperation is a powerful teacher. I started meticulously documenting every interaction, every financial decision, every casual remark that could be twisted into evidence of their intentions. The casual dismissal of my dreams, the swift transfer of funds, the implicit agreement that Daniel's needs trumped mine, it was all becoming a pattern, a narrative I could use. I also started reaching out to people I hadn't thought of in years, former colleagues, acquaintances who had a reputation for being resourceful. I was looking for allies, for people who understood the cutthroat world of business, the kind of people who wouldn't blink at the prospect of a little financial warfare. It was a risky move, a departure from my carefully cultivated image of integrity, but the stakes were too high to play by the old rules. I remembered a conversation with an old law school classmate, someone I'd always found a little too sharp, a little too opportunistic. He'd always had a glint in his eye that suggested he knew where all the bodies were buried, financially speaking. I decided to call him. "Hey, Mark," I said, my voice deliberately casual as he picked up. "It's Eleanor Vance. We haven't spoken in ages." There was a beat of silence on his end. Then, "Eleanor? Wow. To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure?" His tone was guarded, professional. He knew my family, or at least the name. "I'm in a bit of a situation," I began, choosing my words carefully. "A significant financial dispute with my family, involving a substantial sum of money that was reallocated without my consent." Another pause. "Reallocated?" he echoed, a hint of amusement creeping into his voice. "Sounds complicated." "It is," I confirmed, "and I'm exploring my options. I was hoping, given your expertise in navigating complex financial arrangements, you might be able to offer some guidance, or perhaps introduce me to some people who can." He laughed, a dry, almost predatory sound. "Eleanor, you're speaking my language. Tell me more. Over drinks, perhaps? That was the turning point, the moment I stepped out of the role of victim and into the role of strategist. The humiliation from that Sunday dinner was still a raw wound, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fueling me. I could feel the power shifting, not in my favor yet, but the wheels were in motion.
They had taken my money, but they had also given me an education in ruthlessness, and I was going to make sure they regretted it. The $260,000 wasn't just a lost sum. It was an investment in my own, very personal war chest. The silence they had imposed on me was about to be broken by a deafening roar of consequences. The drinks with Mark were illuminating. He didn't flinch when I laid out the situation, the casual way my father had orchestrated the transfer, Daniel's eager complicity. Instead, his eyes lit up. "Classic Vance family dynamics," he'd murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Your father always did prefer the heir apparent, didn't he? And Daniel, well, he's always been adept at playing the part." He explained in clinical, detached terms how a significant portion of my father's assets were held in trusts, meticulously structured years ago. These trusts, he explained, were designed to provide security and capital for his children, but the specifics of distribution, the control over liquidity, were entirely at my father's discretion, particularly while he was alive. He sees himself as the benevolent patriarch doling out favors, Mark explained, and he believes he's doing you a favor by keeping your capital tied up, making sure you don't mismanage it. He probably genuinely thinks he's protecting you in his own twisted way. He then dropped a bombshell. "You know those early investment rounds your father helped Daniel with? The ones that turned his tech startup into a unicorn?" I nodded, remembering the hushed conversations, the pride in Dad's voice when Daniel's company made the news. A lot of that initial capital, the real seed money that gave him leverage for subsequent rounds, came from accounts structured identically to the one your $260K was just swept into. And who was the trustee, the signatory on those accounts, before Daniel became the primary beneficiary and manager of his own holdings? Your father. He's been using family funds, family resources to build Daniel's empire for years. He just never bothered to tell anyone it wasn't entirely Daniel's early ingenuity, but a series of strategically placed loans and investments from the family coffers, which you and your mother are also technically beneficiaries of, albeit passive ones. The implication hit me like a physical blow. My father hadn't just taken my money to bail out Daniel's project. He had been systematically using family capital, my capital implicitly, to elevate Daniel above all of us for years. The $260K wasn't an isolated act of favoritism. It was the continuation of a decades-long pattern. He hadn't asked me to be quiet. He'd expected me to be invisible, a forgotten footnote in Daniel's glorious ascent. The sheer scope of the deception, the calculated manipulation, sent a tremor of something far colder than anger through me. It was a chilling realization of my own naivete. I had been so focused on the immediate sting of losing my savings, on the humiliation of being overlooked, that I hadn't seen the true, elaborate architecture of their power. "So," I said, my voice low and steady, the tremor now replaced by a granite resolve, "you're saying my father essentially used family money, my money, to fund Daniel's rise, and now he's just continued the practice with my personal savings?" Mark gave a wise smile. "Essentially. He's the puppet master and Daniel's his star performer, funded by the family orchestra. He probably sees it as his prerogative, his wealth, his roles. He's built an empire, and in his mind, he gets to decide how the spoils are distributed. And for him, Daniel is the future. You're a well-meaning daughter who needs a gentle nudge towards the sidelines." "A gentle nudge," I repeated, tasting the bitter irony. He called me dramatic. He said I wouldn't be able to leverage that kind of capital anyway. The words, once a source of pain, now felt like fuel. He had actively worked to undermine my confidence, to keep me in my place. He didn't want me to have the capital because he knew what I would do with it. He knew I wouldn't be a passive beneficiary, a quiet supporter of Daniel's ambition. "And that's where you come in," Mark continued, his eyes gleaming with a predatory intelligence. "If you're a beneficiary of those same trusts, even indirectly, and you can prove that your father has been diverting funds, making decisions that benefit one beneficiary over others without proper disclosure or consent, well, that opens up a whole can of worms.
especially if those decisions impact the overall value of the trusts or the equitable distribution of assets. He went on to explain the concept of fiduciary duty, the responsibilities a trustee has to all beneficiaries, not just one. He spoke of legal challenges, of forensic accounting, of ways to compel financial disclosures that my father would likely guard with his life. He laid out a roadmap, a complex, potentially years-long legal battle, but one that could, if successful, unravel the entire structure my father had so carefully constructed. It wasn't going to be quick or easy. It was going to be expensive, and it was going to be dirty. Your father has significant wealth, Mark cautioned. He has top-tier legal teams. He's not going to roll over. This will be a war of attrition. But you have leverage, Eleanor. The leverage of truth. And the leverage of knowing what he's been doing. As I left Mark's office, the city streets felt different. The cacophony of traffic, the hurried footsteps of strangers, all seemed to buzz with a new significance. I was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the overlooked daughter. I was Eleanor Vance, the aggrieved beneficiary, the one who had stumbled upon a secret that could shake the foundations of the Vance empire.
The humiliation hadn't vanished, but it was now a secondary emotion, overshadowed by a potent mix of cold fury and strategic clarity. I spent the next few weeks in a state of hypervigilance, working remotely on my business, but dedicating every spare moment to my new covert mission. I discreetly contacted my mother, not to accuse, but to gather information, framing it as wanting to understand the family's financial structures better. She was hesitant, evasive, as always, but I managed to glean a few crucial details. She mentioned my father's long-standing practice of managing the family finances, his insistence on handling all the important paperwork himself. She confirmed that his lawyer, Mr. Sterling, the same one whose name had appeared on the transaction confirmation, handled all the Vance family's major legal and financial matters, including the trusts. I also reached out to my aunt, my father's younger sister, a woman who had always been a bit of a black sheep, known for her independent spirit and her occasional clashes with my father over his controlling nature. She was surprisingly receptive. "Oh, your father," she'd sighed, her voice weary. "He's always been like that. Thinks he knows best for everyone. He poured everything into Daniel's ventures, said it was an investment in the family's future. Your mother never questioned it, of course, but I always wondered where all that money was coming from. It seemed excessive, even for your father." She confirmed the existence of the trusts and mentioned that my grandmother, before she passed, had expressed concerns about my father's exclusive control over the family's long-term financial planning. The pieces were slotting into place. My father was not just favoring Daniel, he was actively, and I suspected, illegally, leveraging family assets for Daniel's benefit, all under the guise of paternal stewardship. He had robbed me of my independence, my financial future, and in doing so had ignited a firestorm within me. One evening, I was reviewing some of the initial documents Mark had sent me regarding trust law and beneficiary rights. I was scrolling through a digitized archive of my father's legal correspondence, a resource Mark had obtained through a discreet channel. Most of it was standard business jargon, legalistic minutia that made my eyes glaze over. But then, I stumbled upon a series of emails between my father and Mr. Sterling, dated about 6 months prior, well before the $260K transfer. The subject line was innocuous, Daniel's capital requirements. As I read, my blood ran cold. The emails weren't about Daniel's immediate cash flow issues. They were about a complex, long-term financial restructuring. My father was discussing with Sterling how to further consolidate certain family assets, particularly those designated for future distribution to all his children, into new investment vehicles that would give him greater liquidity and control.
He was talking about proactive management and strategic reallocation to maximize growth potential for the primary heir. The primary heir. Daniel. And then, buried deep in the exchange, was a sentence that made my breath catch in my throat. Sterling was replying to my father's proposal for this restructuring. "Arthur," the email read, "while the proposed consolidation is legally sound given your complete control over the current trust structures, I must reiterate my professional caution regarding the potential perception of bias. The specific language you've employed regarding primary heir objectives could, under certain interpretations, be viewed as a breach of fiduciary duty, especially should Eleanor or your wife ever challenge the distribution parameters directly. Perhaps a more general phrasing such as long-term family wealth preservation would be prudent for the record." My father's response, a curt, dismissive one-liner, followed. "Sterling, Eleanor has no head for finances. She's too emotional. Daniel understands business. This is for the best. Just make it happen. And keep it quiet. Keep it quiet. He knew. He knew I would object, that I was not as easily manipulated as he believed. He had deliberately hidden this entire restructuring from me, from my mother. He had taken my $260,000 not as a temporary loan, but as part of a larger, premeditated strategy to secure Daniel's position, to solidify his own power over the family's fortune, and to ensure that I, and my potential for financial independence, would never pose a threat. The sheer calculated malice of it was breathtaking. I sat there, the laptop glowing in the darkened room, the words of Sterling and my father seared into my mind. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about an utter and complete disregard for my personhood, for my autonomy. They saw me as a child to be managed, a pawn to be moved, never an equal to be respected. A wave of something fierce and primal washed over me. It was a primal urge to protect myself, to fight back, to reclaim what was mine. The humiliation was still there, a bitter aftertaste, but it was now mingled with a burning certainty. I had the proof, I had the motive, and I had a very clear understanding of their objective. I knew I couldn't confront them directly, not yet, not with leverage. But I also knew I couldn't wait. My father's restructuring plan was already in motion. Time was not on my side. I needed to act, decisively and strategically. I picked up my phone and dialed Mark. My voice, when I spoke, was steady, devoid of the tremors that had plagued me just weeks before. "Mark," I said, "I think I found it, the smoking gun. And it's a lot bigger than just my $260K. I proceeded to tell him about the emails, about Sterling's warnings and my father's dismissive reply. Mark was silent for a moment. Then his voice, usually so measured, held a new urgency. "Eleanor, this is significant."
This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. This shows intent. This shows a deliberate pattern of preferential treatment and a clear disregard for other beneficiaries. This changes everything. He explained that this new information could be used to petition the court for immediate financial disclosures, to freeze certain assets pending investigation, and potentially to force a restructuring of the trusts that would be more equitable. It was a monumental legal undertaking, but the evidence was now compelling. But, Mark cautioned, your father will fight this tooth and nail. He'll use every legal tactic at his disposal. He might even try to discredit you, paint you as unstable, emotional, just like he said. "Let him," I replied, a dangerous calm settling over me. He underestimated me once. He won't get the chance to do it again. He built his empire on deception. I'm going to dismantle it with the truth. I hung up the phone and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. They twinkled like distant, indifferent stars. My family, my father, Daniel, they were living in their privileged bubble, convinced of their invincibility, of my inherent weakness. They thought they had won. They thought they had silenced me. They were wrong. The silence was over. The reckoning had begun. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs. I was no longer just fighting for my money. I was fighting for my legacy and for the satisfaction of seeing their carefully constructed world crumble around them. The fight would be brutal, but I was ready. I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, and I was going to make them pay, in full. The image of my father's condescending smile flashed in my mind, and a chilling certainty settled deep within my bones. This was just the prelude. The real storm was coming. The call with Mark was the catalyst. Suddenly, the endless late nights poring over legal jargon and financial statements, the hushed phone calls with my aunt, the subtle probing of my mother, it all coalesced into a tangible strategy. It wasn't just about recovering my stolen savings anymore. It was about exposing the rot at the core of the Vance empire, a dynasty built on a foundation of manipulation and a deep-seated contempt for anyone who didn't fit my father's narrow definition of success. My father, Arthur Vance, a man who prided himself on his shrewdness, his foresight, his absolute control. He saw himself as a titan, a benevolent dictator of his own vast financial kingdom, and he viewed his children as assets to be managed, their futures preordained by his grand design. Daniel, the golden boy, the heir apparent, was the shining jewel, the recipient of his father's unwavering faith,
and, as it turned out, an endless stream of family capital. And
I was the inconvenient variable, the one whose unpredictable nature, whose emotional responses, as he so eloquently put it, made me unfit to be entrusted with anything more than a passive allowance. Mark's expertise was invaluable. He understood the intricate dance of trust law, the loopholes my father's lawyers would undoubtedly exploit, the sheer audacity of a man who believed he was above reproach. He explained the concept of coercive control within financial contexts, how my father's actions weren't just about favoring Daniel, but actively disempowering me, isolating me, making me financially dependent and therefore controllable. The $260K wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated move, a tightening of the noose. And Sterling's email, that casual acknowledgement of my father's intentions while feigning professional concern, was the smoking gun. It was proof that my father knew, with chilling certainty, what he was doing, and that he was actively attempting to conceal it from me. He wanted to keep me quiet, compliant, and ultimately irrelevant. The weeks that followed were a blur of carefully orchestrated movements. I maintained the facade of the dutiful, if slightly disgruntled daughter. I attended family gatherings, polite smiles plastered on my face, while inside a cold fury simmered. Daniel, oblivious and smug, regaled us with tales of his company's latest triumphs, his gaze occasionally flicking towards our father, seeking that familiar nod of approval. My mother, bless her heart, remained blissfully unaware, her world confined to her garden and her bridge club, shielded from the machinations of her husband's empire. My father, Arthur, was radiating an almost paternalistic warmth, a practiced performance of generosity that masked the steel beneath. He spoke of legacy, of securing the family's future, of ensuring Daniel's continued success. Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to reinforce his narrative of benevolent patriarch. He even casually mentioned how proud he was of my pragmatic approach to my business, a thinly veiled jab at my perceived lack of financial acumen. I nodded, feigned a grateful smile, and inwardly plotted my revenge. The humiliation still stung, a phantom ache that reminded me of their shared contempt, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was now a sharp, motivating force. Mark began the legal process, filing the necessary petitions for discovery. It was a labyrinthine undertaking, designed to be slow, expensive, and exhausting. My father's legal team, led by none other than Mr. Sterling himself, immediately pushed back, labeling my claims as frivolous, the assertions of a disgruntled daughter seeking to exploit her father's generosity. They presented a united front, a wall of impeccably tailored suits and condescending smiles, determined to quash any challenge to Arthur Vance's absolute authority.
But they underestimated the power of a well-documented truth and the sheer tenacity of a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. Mark's team meticulously pieced together the financial history, tracing the flow of funds, the intricate web of shell corporations and offshore accounts my father had established to obscure his dealings. Sterling's warning to my father about the potential perception of bias became our trump card. It was no longer just about my $260K. It was about a pattern of deliberate manipulation, a systematic siphoning of family assets for the benefit of one child at the expense of others. The court ordered the disclosure of certain financial records. The initial documents that trickled in were heavily redacted, a frustrating testament to my father's legal team's efforts to withhold crucial information. But within those pages, hidden between the lines of boilerplate legal language, were clues. References to discretionary distributions that seemed to bypass traditional channels, strategic investments that inexplicably mirrored Daniel's company's funding rounds, and numerous transfers to accounts that, with further digging, we could link back to entities controlled by Daniel. The true breakthrough came when a junior associate on Mark's team, a sharp, observant young woman named Sarah, discovered a discrepancy in the tax filings of one of Arthur's holding companies. A significant portion of the company's income was listed as consulting fees, paid out to a separate entity, which through a series of convoluted transactions ultimately funneled money into Daniel's startup's early investment rounds. The dates and amounts matched perfectly with the timelines of Daniel's seed funding, the very funding my father had always presented as Daniel's own brilliant entrepreneurial achievement. This wasn't just preferential treatment, this was outright fraud.
My father hadn't just been using family money to build Daniel's empire. He had been actively disguising it as legitimate business expenses, creating an elaborate shell game to maintain the illusion of Daniel's self-made success, while the Vance family coffers were systematically drained. The irony was almost poetic. The man who built his fortune on astute financial management was now using it to prop up his son's fabricated legacy, all while simultaneously penalizing his own daughter for her perceived financial recklessness. As this new evidence emerged, the atmosphere in my father's opulent estate, usually a place of quiet, controlled power, began to shift. Whispers started to circulate amongst the staff, hushed conversations about lawyers coming and going at odd hours. My father's usual composure began to fray at the edges. He became more irascible, his temper shorter, his pronouncements laced with a defensive arrogance. He saw the legal process not as a pursuit of truth, but as a personal affront, a betrayal by his own blood.
The crucial moment arrived during a tense, court-ordered mediation session. My father, Arthur Vance, sat across the polished mahogany table, his face a mask of indignant fury. Daniel sat beside him, a bewildered expression on his face, clearly out of his depth. Sterling, ever the stoic guardian of the Vance interests, sat poised, ready to deflect any accusation. Mark laid out the new findings, his voice calm and measured, presenting the evidence of the disguised consulting fees and their direct correlation to Daniel's startup funding. He spoke of fiduciary duty, of fraud, of the devastating consequences of such deceit. Arthur Vance, a man who had never shown an ounce of weakness, visibly blanched, his usual color drained from his face, leaving him looking gaunt and exposed. Daniel, catching sight of his father's reaction, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between his father and the damning documents. "This is preposterous," Sterling boomed, his voice echoing in the otherwise silent room. "These are baseless accusations, manufactured to extort money from Mr. Vance. My client has always acted with the utmost integrity." "Integrity?" I said, my voice cutting through the tense air. It was the first time I had spoken directly to my father in this setting. My voice was low, controlled, but it carried the weight of weeks of meticulous planning and a lifetime of suppressed anger. "Is it integrity to lie to your children, to systematically defraud them, to use family assets, assets that rightfully belong to all of us, to build one child's empire while deliberately undermining another?" My father's eyes, usually sharp and calculating, flickered with something akin to panic. He looked at Sterling, a silent plea for rescue. Sterling, however, seemed to be reassessing the situation, the sheer weight of the new evidence perhaps finally dawning on him. "Mr. Vance," Mark continued, addressing Arthur directly, his tone devoid of emotion, "the evidence suggests that for years you have been systematically diverting funds, disguised as business expenses, to facilitate your son's ventures. You've done this while knowingly concealing these actions from other beneficiaries, including your daughter, Eleanor. Furthermore, your own legal counsel, Mr. Sterling, explicitly warned you of the potential legal ramifications of such actions, advising you that your language indicated a breach of fiduciary duty. Your response, Eleanor has no head for finances. She's too emotional. Daniel understands business. This is for the best, is not the statement of a man acting in the best interest of all his beneficiaries. It is the statement of a man intentionally disenfranchising his daughter and perpetuating a financial fraud." The carefully constructed facade of Arthur Vance finally crumbled. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him ashen.
He stared at the documents, then at me, then at Daniel, who looked utterly devastated, his perception of his own success shattering before his eyes. You fabricated this," Arthur stammered, his voice a weak rasp. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice unwavering. "I uncovered it. You built your empire on a foundation of lies, and now the truth is coming to light. You wanted to control my finances, to keep me dependent. You wanted Daniel to be the sole inheritor, the shining symbol of your success. But you forgot one crucial thing. You forgot that I am your daughter, and you underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my willingness to fight for what is rightfully mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling, his professional detachment gone, looked utterly stunned. Daniel, his face pale, finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of his father's deception and the implications for his own achievements. He hadn't earned his success. It had been gifted to him, funded by the very family he believed he was elevating. "The funds you diverted, Arthur," Mark stated, his voice amplifying the finality of the situation, "were not yours to give.
They were part of family trusts, established for the benefit of all your children. The amount in question, considering the compounding interest and the investment growth Daniel's company has experienced, easily runs into the tens of millions. We are seeking full restitution, including disgorgement of profits and punitive damages. Furthermore, given the evidence of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, the court will likely be compelled to restructure the Vance family trusts, ensuring a fair and equitable distribution of assets for all beneficiaries moving forward. And your role as trustee will undoubtedly be terminated, replaced by an independent administrator. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow to Arthur Vance's carefully constructed world. His power, his control, his legacy, all of it was dissolving before his eyes. He looked like a man who had been stripped bare, his arrogance replaced by a profound, hollow shock. Daniel remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table, his entire identity, built on the illusion of his own genius, now in ruins. The mediation session ended abruptly, not with a resolution, but with a chilling realization for Arthur Vance. He had orchestrated a lifetime of deception, believing he was untouchable. But in his relentless pursuit of control and his absolute conviction of his own superiority, he had made one fatal error. He had underestimated the daughter he dismissed as too emotional. The legal battle that followed was brutal and protracted. Arthur Vance's legal team fought tooth and nail, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sterling, facing potential disbarment, offered crucial testimony regarding Arthur's direct instructions and his awareness of the legal implications.
Daniel, shattered by the revelation that his success was built on his father's deceit, eventually cooperated, his testimony further dismantling Arthur's defense. The judgment was a resounding victory. The Vance family trusts were restructured, distributing the assets equitably among all of Arthur's children, including myself, who had been systematically denied my rightful inheritance. Arthur Vance was stripped of his trusteeship, his reputation in tatters, his empire tarnished beyond repair. He was forced to liquidate significant assets to satisfy the restitution order, a devastating blow to his pride and his financial standing. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek public vindication. My victory was a private one, a quiet reclaiming of my autonomy and my financial independence. I had my $260K back, but more importantly, I had the satisfaction of knowing that the truth had prevailed. I had faced the architect of my humiliation and emerged not only unscathed, but stronger, my resolve forged in the fires of betrayal. My father and I never spoke again. The chasm between us was too wide, the damage too profound. Daniel and I have begun a tentative, fragile reconciliation, built on a shared understanding of our father's manipulative nature and the need to rebuild our lives on honest ground. He is slowly coming to terms with his own complicity, the weight of his father's deceptions a heavy burden to bear. Walking away from the courthouse after the final ruling, the setting sun cast long shadows across the city. The air felt crisp, clean, filled with the promise of a new beginning. The anger and humiliation had faded, replaced by a profound sense of peace, of hard-won freedom. I looked up at the sky, a faint smile touching my lips. I had not only survived, I had triumphed, and the silence that had once defined my existence was now filled with the quiet hum of my own power, a sound more satisfying than any inheritance. The life I had built for myself, brick by painstaking brick, was now truly mine, secured by a strength I never knew I possessed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm, clear horizon.